Welcome to the summer series of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. In today's episode, you will hear from 4 presenters at our 2024 conference. The first is Dr. William Stoltz on his paper Managed Decolonisation. The second is Sean Jacobs on Relaxed and Comfortable, Menzies and the Fall of Empire, 1961 to 66. The third paper is delivered by Dr. David Furse-Roberts on Homes Material, Homes Human and Homes Spiritual, the Menzies Government and Housing Policy. The fourth and final paper is by Dr. Christopher Beer on The Frontier of Property-Owning Democracy, Housing, the Reform of Australian Liberal Urbanism and Electoral Politics in Western Sydney, 1961 to 66.
Well, thank you for that kind introduction, Zach, and thanks to Georgina and Zach for, this is the 4th one of these conferences I've attended, and I think it's the second one you've given me the permission to speak at, so thank you for entertaining my strange ideas, and today will be kind of no exception. Another strange idea for the Robert Menzies Institute on the topic of managed decolonisation. So, from the 1960s, as the British Empire faded from Australia's region, the recolonisation of former imperial possessions became politically unpalatable and practically unfeasible. In response, the Australian government turned its attention to what I've decided to call the managed decolonisation of former Western territories in the Asia Pacific. For British-administered territories, including Australia's, the process was focused on gradually creating economically viable, politically friendly, liberal democratic nations that would remain within the Commonwealth family. The process was unashamedly paternalistic, and for many of the local nationalists in these territories, frustratingly slow. Managed decolonisation would leverage international financial institutions and UN organs to give a degree of guidance to transitioning territories and to associate the whole process to UN aims so as to dampen anti-colonial criticism. However, knowing that the Australian government alone would have limited influence in this process, in these projects, and wanting to particularly focus on the managed decolonisation of its neighbouring territories, in the early 1960s, Australia looked to draw in American interest in the transition of the territories in the Pacific when the British Commonwealth had assessed, which the British Commonwealth had assessed as underprepared for independence. So to kind of give a bit of a historical kind of context leading up to this policy of managed decolonisation, we have this concept of the Pacific Empire at the heart of Australian policy up until this point. Very much kind of born from Alfred Deakin's view that Australia should have a larger role in guiding the direction and administration of British territories in the Pacific, and his pursuit as well to draw in American power into the region to really underscore the sense that the region would be guided by Western aspirations for development. And that's kind of borne out by what many of you would be aware of, the visit of the Great White Fleet, and other efforts to try and bring in American power. And it should be noted that much of the annexation of Pacific territories kind of leading up to Federation had been very championed and led by Australia and New Zealand as well. Britain had at times been quite lukewarm on the expansion of British territories in the region, but Australia and New Zealand had really pushed it. Jumping forward to the process after the Great War, Billy Hughes had been very forward-leaning in wanting Australia to acquire territories in the post-war settlement. And he and Joseph Lyons had continued this idea of bringing in the Americans as well with that concept of the Pacific Pact. And lest this be perceived as a centre-right aspiration, you see in John Curtin's post-war address during the war, late war address in December 1943, advocating the recolonisation of territories in what he called a kind of Fourth Empire phase, a rejuvenation of British power in the region after the war and as part of that settlement. And then we have, during the Malayan emergency, the creation of the ANZAM grouping of Australia, New Zealand and Malaya. Again, another planning body to try and bring in and sustain Western power in the future of these regions, of these countries in the Pacific. So just a quick comment on Menzies in the Pacific. this whole idea of the Pacific Empire would not have been kind of anathema to him. That would have been quite uncontroversial to his cabinet colleagues as well. He first brushed up, I suppose, with the challenges of sustaining Western power in the Pacific when he becomes Prime Minister for the first time and is confronted with the frailties of the Singapore strategy that we all know kind of collapsed and underpinned much of the failures of the Second World War. We also have in the post-war environment as well, Menzies being very supportive of Portuguese reoccupation of Timor, and there's even assessments at the time that suggest that Australia would be willing to underwrite Portuguese and other colonial powers returning to the region. And just for this discussion of managed decolonisation, the relevant ministers that are in his orbit here are Minister for External Affairs, Garfield Barwick, who is Minister for External Affairs, and then we have Paul Hasluck as well for territories. So just a quick kind of context there. So getting as well to what generates this policy of managed decolonisation is really the birth of a regional consciousness for Australia. With the drawback of British power in the region, you have this gradual psychological shift amongst Australian politicians and strategy makers that they need to find security within Asia rather than security from Asia. You have the CETO experiment kicked off in 1955 to generate a kind of concept of regional multilateralism to underwrite security. And we also have in 1966, a bit later, the creation of the Asian and Pacific Council, which ends up being a bit of a failed experiment, but is nevertheless an important body because of the fact that it's a regional grouping in which Australia is present in the region without the UK and the US as well. And as many of you know, we also have later, after Menzies with Holt, the dismantling of the White Australia policy, again kind of recognising that Australia is part of the region. So that's an important psychological shift that's in the background here as we talk about managed decolonisation. In terms of the politics of decolonisation generally, that map kind of shows you a bit of a sense of, at the end of World War II, the demarcation of the territories amongst the powers, with a lot of red and green there indicating territories that have been essentially recolonised or reoccupied. And Australia's priority was very much to swiftly reoccupy the Papua New Guinean territories and to ensure, as I mentioned, the reintroduction of the Portuguese into Timor. And there is this overriding objective as well to entangle Britain and the US in the region, to make sure that there is not a withdrawal of Western power and to check that anti-colonial narrative that's emerging within the United Nations. So as a result, Australia is trying to build a policy consensus with the British and Americans on how to handle the development of these territories. This is reflected in an exchange of letters from 1962 between Australia's relevant ministers, Barwick and Hasluck. In their exchange, Barwick explains to Hasluck that there should be a consensus between Australians, British and Americans on how to handle the development of dependent territories in order to head off, quote, powerful and critical inquiries from the UN in which Australia could otherwise find itself very much alone. Australia therefore adopted a policy of only supporting the establishment of states believed to be sustainable and that would not be subject to internal security crises or become sources of regional insecurity themselves. This gradualist attitude was intended not to contradict American policies, which were far more cool on the prospect of relinquishing territories. The United States observed closely the decolonisation policies being developed by the UK, New Zealand and Australia during the early 1960s, because if the British world were to be swifter or less conditional in its approach to granting independence, it could, quote, complicate the US exercise of swallowing US territories into the United States. And that's particularly in relation to Guam and American Samoa. So accordingly, the Australian government in the 1960s was willing to move slowly on the question of PNG self-determination so as to not accelerate the international trend of decolonisation to a point that would make it uncomfortable for the Americans. So that said, Menzies' cabinet did not want to sit on their hands when it came to the question of decolonisation. Australia saw an opportunity to instigate a more favourable security environment if the Americans were undisrupted in their efforts to incorporate their Pacific territories into the United States. With an unpredictable and somewhat hostile Indonesian neighbour now sharing a land border with Australia and a northern region under threat of communist insurgency, the Australian government mused that the American retention and consolidation of its Pacific territories may be a favourable step towards the maintenance, if not expansion, of American power in the region. As one secret government briefing in 1962 explained, quote, "If the Americans accomplish the incorporation of the Trust Territory in the United States, American soil will be less than 200 miles from Indonesian territory, and a line of islands, part of the United States, will run some 1,000 miles north of New Guinea." So the Australian government therefore believed that if the process of decolonisation in the Pacific could be handled deftly and in close coordination with the United States, Australia could not only maintain the security status quo, but possibly realise opportunities for, quote, "reinforcing and consolidating our security relationship with the United States through arrangements embracing the Pacific relationship with the United States." Embracing the Pacific territories in the north and east of Australia. The holy grail of such a reinforcement was obviously to expand the ANZUS guarantee, something that was a realistic aspiration at the time, given that in 1962, Australia had received, quote, "reaffirmation of the application of ANZUS to Papua and New Guinea." So, turning to this policy of managed decolonisation. In the 1960s, policies of recolonisation were replaced with what my paper will call policies of managed decolonisation, and this is very much first formalised in the recommendations of the 1962 South Pacific Study. The South Pacific Study Group provided the basis for Australia's first policies of managed decolonisation and proved particularly useful for maintaining an Anglo-American consensus on the development of the territories. Barwick was the Australian government's chief advocate for this idea of managed decolonisation during his time in office, and believed firmly that to, quote, "keep Oceania free or relatively free of Chinese and communist influence," end quote, Australia needed to get the United States government invested in the managed transition of regional territories, particularly in the South Pacific. To this end, Barwick's delegation to the 1962 ANZUS meeting successfully argued the need for a more concerted approach by the ANZUS countries towards the decolonisation of the South Pacific, and the meeting established a four-power South Pacific Study Group to investigate the challenges and opportunities involved in the South Pacific's decolonisation and to review options for a coordinated policy approach between Australia, America, New Zealand and the UK. The study group principally recommended that while the governments should support in-principle independence for Pacific territories, in the short term, quote, "administering powers should plan for a status less than sovereign independence," end quote, for most of the region, except for those territories the study group believed could handle self-determination, these being Papua New Guinea, the Solomons, Fiji and Tonga. It proposed, quote, "other solutions that hinted at federating smaller territories via a gradual path to statehood involving, quote, "integration, free association and transfers of sovereignty with the consent of all people concerned." These other solutions would allow the UK and America in particular to offer territories steps towards nationhood that would satisfy UN critics, but in a managed way that would not compromise important strategic installations in these territories, such as the facilities being used for joint nuclear surveillance and space projects. The study group also made the case for building institutions of Pacific regionalism, stating that, quote, "the development of wider and at the same time tighter groupings presents one possibility of making the territories more viable and hence more stable, and of building up their resistance to outside pressures." However, it would not be until the emergence of the South Pacific Forum in 1971 that the Australian government felt comfortable enough to support Pacific states supplanting Western association with self-initiated regionalism. So in 1963, when he presented the study group's report, Barwick explained to his cabinet colleagues that the study group had achieved Australia's, quote, "final objective to induce US interest in the South Pacific area." The Australian government's success in this regard was to use the spectre of communist states arising in the Pacific to link the decolonisation of the South Pacific to America's Cold War strategic interests. This allowed Australia to overcome the previous prevailing American opinion that responsibility for the future of former colonies rested with the paternal state, in the South Pacific's case being mostly the UK and European countries. As Christopher Waters has explained, Cabinet was uneasy with Barwick's enthusiasm to allow the study group to drive multilateral policy planning between the four countries, but it did nevertheless endorse the study group's recommendations, quote, as broad guidelines for Australian policy in the Pacific and as the basis for further exchanges with our allies. The Australian government's proactive engagement with the 1962 South Pacific Study Group and its gradual integration of many of the group's policy recommendations into its own approach marked, in my view, the end of recolonisation in the psyche of Australian internationalism. While an embrace of constructive decolonisation had been percolating for at least the previous decade, the South Pacific Study Group marked the first occasion that the Australian government adopted a coherently devised policy for managed decolonisation rather than retention within the empire. This is not to say that the Australian government was eager to accelerate the decolonisation or anti-colonialism, as it was referred to in Cabinet. Views persisted in the 1960s that if decolonisation of Western territories in the region was to occur, it should be done in a gradual, managed approach. Then Treasurer Harold Holt reflected this prevailing view when he remarked to Cabinet in 1962 that, quote, time is on our side in colonial questions. He even cast doubt on the potency of independence movements themselves, stating that the fashion of independence may not be the fashion in the future. In the end, the study group's recommendations proved influential upon the United States' own policies as well towards decolonisation in the Pacific, with the following recommendations being adopted as American policy. Firstly, the US State Department accepted the, quote, administering powers should plan for a status less than sovereign independence for the Pacific territories, except possibly in the case of the larger territories, such as Papua New Guinea, the Solomons, Fiji, and Tonga. Secondly, they adopted the recommendation that the recommended preference for, quote, treaty relationships, providing for the former administering power to look after the defence and foreign relations in the new nation. And thirdly, they accepted that independence should only be allowed to progress in circumstances that would not place in jeopardy the security of the region. So in terms of questions that I think need to be answered in the final version of my paper, what I still need to understand in more detail is Menzies' own personal role in this policy. How decisive was he? His approach to cabinet government meant that he was quite happy with something of a team of rivals, very large and dominant personalities who were steeped within their policy expertise. Certainly that was the case with Hasluck and with Barwick, who very, very principally drove this policy development alongside Holt. But it should be noted that after Menzies did depart cabinet, these policies accelerated in his absence. Another question I want to explore in greater depth was how disruptive was Holt's death to the continuity of this policy. Holt, upon becoming Prime Minister, had been very forward-leaning in emphasising that regional consciousness I spoke about before. He embarked on a very wide-ranging tour of the region in 1967, which blitzed a number of countries in Southeast Asia. So he was clearly very passionate about demonstrating to the region that Australia had kind of turned over a new leaf. But how much was his departure from the scene disruptive to the continuity of managed decolonisation? And the other question I want to explore in more depth was what were Labor's attitudes to this at the time? Because obviously we know that upon becoming Prime Minister, Whitlam accelerates these processes much, much faster than the Australian government had previously anticipated. But had that been the view prior to his arrival on the scene as well? So those are some things that I'm going to continue kind of working on in the final version. But thank you for your attention and happy to take your questions.
Thank you very much, Zach, and thank you all. That was fascinating. And look, yeah, thank you everyone. My name's Sean Jacobs, and Georgina, sorry in particular for this opportunity. And my paper is on Menzies and the fall of empire, and actually presented last year on Menzies and the West New Guinea dispute. So it's genuinely great to be back. Now, I fully appreciate that I'm standing between all of you and lunch, so I promise to not trespass too much on my time. But I just wanted to cover these broad points in particular. And a lot of this is, I hope, kind of a collective counter-attack or counterpunch to the British to the bootstraps charge that Menzies often faces and his supposedly excessive over-attachment to Britain and to empire. And obviously Menzies had a fondness for Britain, like any leader of his generation, but this was never at the expense of Australia or Australian interests. Indeed, he used this lovely term that Australians were British in sentiments and traditions only, that we weren't lock, stock British when it came to culture and society, and that's a point that he made well before, actually in the mid-1930s, I'll expand on very shortly. For Menzies, Australia came first. I think, as we've heard over, particularly this morning and just before in the last two presentations, that given our strategic reality in the 1950s and 1960s, Australia had to come first, given what was going on in our neck of the woods. Menzies, of course, was accused, or probably more of his legacy, of being stuck in the past by being attached to old alliances, and especially approaching the early 1960s and the new nationalism movement that emerged at the time. And he actually encouraged humility in Australia's foreign policy, which is something that's anathema, particularly to that new nationalism crowd that wins few prizes in foreign policy, especially when it comes to legacy, and certainly drives those charges of being stuck in the past. And obviously Menzies, I'm pretty sure everyone here will appreciate, was very disappointed by what the Commonwealth had actually become. But I don't finish on a sour note, and I talk a little bit about the new Commonwealth. So the new Commonwealth was obviously the post-Empire Commonwealth that Menzies referred to, and I kind of want to finish on a bit of a high note. So the title of my presentation or paper will no doubt be familiar to everyone in this room. It's, of course, the term that John Howard used in his 1997 Australia Day address, for which he received quite some grief. But I found it a useful phrase, but even a framework as well, to view Menzies in the wake of the fall of empire in particular. Indeed, these terms might be more contemporary than the 61 to 66 era we're contemplating at this conference, and I see Zach ready to wrap me over the knuckles, but they evoke very similar sentiments to the criticisms of Menzies' attachment to empire. And I do find these critiques just so peculiar, because to look back at this time in particular and emerging into the 1960s, you truly see Menzies' performance at this time as one of just purely Asian achievement, whilst sustaining, of course, deep values-based attachments to Britain. Indeed, by the early 1960s, Menzies and his cabinet, guided by postures far from fearful or anxious, confidently built economic and people-to-people links with Asian governments and simultaneously steered Australia through an intelligent resistance to communism, according to Richard Nixon. So the Colombo Plan, started by Spender in 1951, produced significant people-to-people links that blossomed to 20,000 students only a few decades later in the mid-80s. ANZUS and CETO, Menzies reflected, materially added to our safety, and I think that's absolutely true. And you could argue that ANZUS was motivated by Britain's lack of commitment to Singapore in World War II in the early 1940s. And of course, all these achievements are taking place against the backdrop of the Korean and Vietnam Wars, the Suez Crisis, the West New Guinea dispute, as I mentioned before, and the Malayan emergency and the expansion of communism. So now, in terms of the first point, it's true that Menzies, like most Australian leaders of his generation, devoted a great deal to Britain. This wasn't uncommon. A lot of people here will be very familiar with Chifley's 1948 claim that, and I'll quote, "Australians know that our future is linked with Britain, not only by ties of race and kinship, but because of hard, practical reasons," end quote. Now, Menzies acknowledged the obvious fact that Australian institutions were entirely shaped by Britain. You know, there are, of course, exceptions. We didn't adopt a House of Lords like Daniel Dennehy notably termed in 1853 a bunyip aristocracy, but it's undeniable that the source code of how we make laws and function and interact with our political system is just distinctively British. This is just simply a reality. And I think that Menzies truly knew that empire had ended at the end of World War II. I think if you examine anything in the historical record, and I think a quote I've put up there from the Times alludes to that, and the changing temperature on empire that Menzies was entirely alive to. And the other interesting element was from a speech he gave that I touched on before, well back in 1935 to Chatham House, pointing to the fact that Australians weren't British transplants, but almost culturally British in sentiments and traditions only. And apologies, the text is a little bit smaller than I anticipated. But notable here, and I really wanted to dive into this, was just Menzies' use of the term, because to me that alludes to a British or an English universalism that's increasingly lost, I guess, on a contemporary audience, particularly the foreign policy community. I don't think one needs to possess a certain complexion or even to be born in London to appreciate distinctively British democratic institutions and values, rule of law, liberty, respect, tolerance, plurality, and the individual achievements that can emerge in such settings. And I think that these values in particular cooperate strongly with the legacy of British institutions I just mentioned before, a Westminster system, English common law, responsible government, and perhaps not always a love of cricket. And as I hope not too much of a detour, in my chapter I touched on a couple of very Menzian international examples of, I think, where this applies. So young Nelson Mandela, for example, growing up in 1920s Natal, expressed great pride attending a British school, and I'll quote, "At the time, Britain was the home of everything that was best in the world." He underscored that Britain, the home of parliamentary democracy, even offered motivation against apartheid. Other diverse figures touched by empire, from Trinidadian writer V.S. Naipaul to Nigerian academic and novelist Chinua Achebe, pay similar nods to Britain and the creative and cultural freedoms that emerged under empire and colonialism. And there's a very clear overlap with the presentation on the Commonwealth scholarships yesterday around choice, flexibility, dignity. These individuals were offered this kind of space under Britain and under empire. And I'll just include a very Menzian quote. I didn't put it on the screen, but I'll just read it out from V.S. Naipaul. When he talked about the idea of London as an open access, or Britain or the British Empire as an open access civilisation. And he said, "I don't imagine my father's parents would have been able to understand the idea. So much is contained in it. The idea of the individual, responsibility, choice, the life of the intellect, the idea of vocation and perfectibility and achievement." So that was Naipaul talking in 1991 about the British Empire, and it's just a very, very, very Menzian language. And I think these points are just very worthy of contemplation, and especially against the charge that Menzies was just excessively attached to Britain, or actually unpacking what that really means. And if you say that Menzies was an excessive Anglophile, then so too are figures like this. So for Menzies, as I touched on before, Australia always came first. I think it just had to, given the strategic environment that we were in the 1950s and coming into the 1960s. The 1950s in particular were not an easy foreign policy decade, and some of the examples are on the screen there. And I've noted this because the reality of the environment that Menzies faced, of course, coming into the late 50s and the early 1960s. And I think purely just because of the strategic environment, it just offered very little space to fall back or to simply relish sentimentality at the expense of practical ties and navigating the region economically, politically and militarily. And I think Will really well touched on that before. And I think just any Prime Minister of any stripe that was excessively attached to Britain at the expense of the strategic environment would never have been able to navigate any such outcomes. So further examples show, well prior to the early 1960s, there was a very specific focus on Asia and the Pacific. So this is a quote, and again, I'm very sorry for how small it is, but from Spender launching the Colombo Plan in the early 1950s. And it's, I guess, a weary but positive example. It just very much sums up Australia's outlook that was very much focused on our region and people-to-people ties in particular. And if we look at other products like ANZUS over 6 decades later, today remains in place. CETO in 3 years after ANZUS, but nations as diverse as Britain, France, New Zealand, Pakistan, Thailand, the United States and the Philippines provided a collective shield against communism in Southeast Asia. And Abbott and Labor were hostile to both agreements, Menzies highlighted, towards the end of the 1950s at the 1958 election. So on broad reflection, Menzies' foreign policy towards the end of the 50s appeared to be based on two fundamentals in particular. So the first was to maintain friendly relations, to be good neighbours, to have powerful friends. And the second appeared a blend of reality and humility, as I touched on before. He said that a foreign policy should be sensible, useful, not noisy, calculated to increase our security, not to lose friends. Now, it's this second fundamental where, where we can actually trace the accusations of Menzies' supposedly excessive British foreign policy. Indeed, some critics see a humble and a rational foreign policy as code for two things. One, a lack of ambition to think big in terms of foreign relations, and two, resting too much on old identities at the expense of creating new ones. Indeed, you can see this so clearly in current claims about Menzies' excessive Britishness. So on the slide, for example, is former Foreign Minister, Gareth Evans, writing in his 2017 memoirs. And whilst Evans noted the open-minded international outlook of Holt, Gorton and Hasluck, and the achievements of Spender, Casey and McEwen, he also writes of Menzies' excruciating Anglophilia. So I won't read out the entire quote, but I just raise this point just to highlight, despite so much regional Asian achievement that we've touched on over the last few days, and I touched on before, Menzies is still labelled like this. So just reflecting and coming to a close, in the early 1960s, there's clearly something unquenchable about the criticisms of Menzies' foreign policy achievements in particular. And I think these rest upon this fundamental and perennial question of Australia's identity at the time of cultural transition, as Zach mentioned in the conference commentary. Indeed, Menzies may achieve positive outcomes, but for his critics, these just didn't go far enough. His achievements failed to square with Australia's changing demographics, they charge, Asia's perceptions of Australia and the region's economic and political ascendance. So, furthermore, the residual effects of British influence over Australia's foreign policy, especially in the post-World War II era, supplemented by Menzies' conservative worldview, are simply all too much to be excited about or build upon as a legacy in the 21st century. So just coming to a close, the final point that I wanted to make is this one, that Menzies was clearly saddened by what the Commonwealth had become. He'd recognised its decline and dissipation, but it became clear from correspondence with Macmillan that was unsealed a few years ago in particular, that he was very concerned with the political trajectory of many post-Empire nations. And I've got a couple of quotes there in particular around India and other nations as well. So rather than finish on a low note, I just wanted to close out by building on a point that Menzies made in the 1950s, that we have the Commonwealth divided in structure, though still associated in function. It demands study and understanding. And I use the term new Commonwealth, as Menzies called the new Commonwealth, obviously the post-Empire Commonwealth. So I think the new Commonwealth in particular just offers 4 points to study and understand if it's to be relevant and maintain some function in the 21st century. So that point about the first one there, sentiments and traditions, I think that's really important, especially around the capacity of individuals to grow and to build, as Menzies strongly believed in. The second point's a very Niall Ferguson-esque point, I guess, but there's a critical difference between being settled by Spanish, French or Portuguese empires versus the British, as we were in Australia. And I think that's just a point worthy of contemplation when we consider alternate histories, but when we also just consider political systems and institutions around the world. The third point, Achebe, Naipaul, Mandela. So these individuals thrived under the very things that Menzies believed in. A point I just raised on the first point, that space for individuals to flourish. And then just the fourth point, a lot of people forget that rather than, if you look back to the early 2000s, and I'm not saying that we need to resuscitate the Commonwealth or CHOGM in particular as an international institution, but it was a very unlikely press conference duo of Thabo and Mbeki from South Africa and John Howard exerting pressure on Robert Mugabe, going back to the early 2000s. And I think important alliances like that are really just, again, very important to consider about how we collectively respond to other democracies and other wayward democracies, especially as part of the post-empire or the new Commonwealth world. And again, it's no need to resuscitate Chogham and the Menzian name, but rather find common themes to animate foreign policy in the theme of this year's conference for Menzies and purpose, endurance and legacy. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Zach and Georgina, and to the team of at RMI. It's wonderful to be back in marvellous Melbourne. They say that if you can't afford to do Europe, you just come to Melbourne, right? And even the gelato tastes just as good. Almost, anyway. So today, obviously, we're looking at housing and Menzies' approach to home ownership. Now, one of Menzies' many public events, a heckler yelled out to him, shouting, "What you gonna do about housing, Bob?" Menzies shot back, remarking, "Put an H in front of it." In his landmark Forgotten People speech of May 1942, Robert Menzies spoke of the importance of home's material, home's human, and home's spiritual. He went on to affirm that the home is the foundation of sanity and sobriety. It is the indispensable condition of continuity. Its health determines the health of society as a whole. From the outset, it is important to appreciate that Menzies' vision for greater home ownership had a historical context. The Australian historian John Murphy recognised that the lived experience of Australians through the travails of depression and then war had given them a real yearning for stability and continuity. Accordingly, home ownership was regarded by many as a solid foundation on which to lay down roots and raise a family. The onset of the Cold War was another factor which drove the appetite for home ownership, with the opposition of communism to private property and even the jibes of Labor's Minister for Post-War Reconstruction, John Dedman, deriding aspiring homeowners as little capitalists. Property ownership was regarded as one of the great bulwarks against any further advances of socialism. Reading the public mood accurately before his return to office in December 1949, Menzies made home ownership a core part of his post-war vision for the country. To give policy substance to his vision for the home, his government introduced some key initiatives during his lengthy second term in office to bring home ownership within the reach of more Australians. Responding to the housing shortages evident during the Depression and the Second World War, the Menzies Government boosted housing supply and devised policies to increase the outright ownership of homes for Australian families. The results of the Menzies Government's housing strategy already bore fruit after 2 terms. In his 1954 election speech, the Prime Minister observed that in the last 3 years of the Chifley Labor government, 140,000 homes were built in Australia, whereas in the past 3 years of his government, 227,000 new dwellings were constructed. Menzies appreciated that the key to boosting housing supply was the reduction of building costs. He remarked that by sound industrial policies, the adequate supply of materials and the steady continuity of work, the costs of building had been reduced. In his bid to return to office, he had vowed to review the incidences of such imposts as sales tax on home fittings and furniture. The lower cost of building would, of course, translate into more affordable houses for Australian families. To encourage home ownership, Menzies proposed the following practical measures in the lead up to the 1954 election. First, the government would partner with the Commonwealth Bank and other financial institutions for continued support to building societies, cooperative societies, and other creditors lending money to home buyers. Second, the government would increase the advance available for the purchase of existing homes from £2,000 to £2,750 under the War Services Homes Act. Third, it would authorise the states to sell housing stock under the housing agreement plan to ex-servicemen tenants of 12 months standing with a maximum advance to the purchaser of, again, £2,750. Finally, for civilian tenants who are non-ex-service personnel, the states would be authorised to sell housing agreement houses for a minimum deposit of 10%. To give effect to these measures, the Menzies Government passed legislation in April 1955, enabling the states to sell their public housing stock to prospective private purchasers on credit terms, rather than keeping this in government hands. Within 4 years, more than 75% of the houses being built each year under the Commonwealth State Housing Agreement were sold to family purchasers. In 1956, the CSHA was renegotiated so that 20% and later 30% was passed on to financial institutions for lending to people to either purchase or build housing. The government's motive behind the policy was clearly aspirational, in helping Australians to realise their dream of owning a home. As Senator William Spooner, the Minister for National Development, explained, we take the view that people who have worked and saved to get enough money to put a deposit on their own homes are at least as entitled to receive some aid from the community's funds as is the person who seeks to solve their housing problem by going on a State Housing Commission waiting list. Consistent with Liberal philosophy, the agreement was not so much about giving people a handout from the government, but rather a hand up to help people attain their goal of home ownership, as opposed to simply being given a welfare check to spend towards a home. People would be given the necessary assistance on a loans basis. To sharpen the government's focus on housing policy, Menzies agreed to establish a new Ministry for Housing in December 1963. As early as 1954, Senator Spooner had proposed to Menzies the establishment of housing as a separate portfolio so that we have a proper perspective and coordinated policy on housing. The first minister appointed to the new housing portfolio in December 1963 was Leslie Bury, the member for Wentworth in Sydney's eastern suburbs. Born in London in 1913, Bury had read economics at Queen's College, Cambridge, before emigrating to Australia in 1935 to take up a position with the Bank of New South Wales. Following successful careers in banking and the Departments of External Affairs and Treasury, Bury won the seat of Wentworth in the December 1956 by-election. An ardent supporter of free trade, Bury was critical of Keynesianism and excessive state interventionism. In 1961, Menzies appointed Bury to his first portfolio as Minister for Air and Minister for Assisting the Treasurer. Despite being sacked from these posts in 1962 for his outspoken views on Britain's integration into the European Common Market, Bury returned to the ministry in 1963 as the inaugural Minister for Housing. As Housing Minister, Bury's most noteworthy achievement was the introduction of a home savings grant for first home buyers in 1964. The scheme offered cash grants for married or engaged couples under the age of 36 to buy a home. To be eligible for the grant, the house or unit purchased needed to be the first home owned by either or both of the married couple upon or after marriage. Eligibility for the grant also had a cap on properties valued at more than £7,000 in 1964 terms, reflecting the view of the government that those acquiring more expensive homes needed less help from the taxpayer. It applied equally to properties in urban and rural areas. Introducing the Home Savings Grant Bill to Parliament, Minister Burey explained how the policy objective of home ownership was eminently conducive to the government's quest to foster family life. Burey told Parliament, "Housing is vital to the welfare and happiness of individuals and thus to our future development as a nation. Without proper housing, the process of marriage and family formation, which are the very essence of Australia's future, must be seriously impaired. The government seeks, moreover, to foster a healthy property-owning democracy of sturdy, independent individuals and regards home ownership as a basic ingredient. It is a linchpin of family life." As well as facilitating marriage and family formation, the legislation was designed to encourage individual thrift, with the incentive for young marrieds to save a portion of their personal income towards the acquisition of a property. Accordingly, the scheme required couples to have accumulated acceptable savings in Australia for at least 3 years to be eligible for a Commonwealth grant of £1 for every £3 of savings for a home. The grant was aimed at encouraging personal saving by young people before they entered into a commitment to acquire their own home. Finally, the Menzies Government established the Housing Loans Insurance Corporation, HLIC, in 1965 to provide a government-supported housing loan insurance scheme to help homeowners. As Menzies himself had noted, many people found that to fill the gap between available housing loans and the buying requirement of a purchaser, it was necessary for the purchaser to borrow money, frequently on oppressive terms. To help remedy this, the Menzies Government's HLIC would insure approved lenders against loss arising from the making of loans for housing. With the government guarantee involved in this scheme, people would be able to borrow as a single loan at a reasonable rate of interest nearly all of the money they needed. Menzies said that the loans, being the subject of a guarantee, would extend to something like 3 times the borrower's established income with a reasonable ceiling. The government would, up to a high percentage of valuation, ranging up to 95% in appropriate cases, ensure the repayment of such loans by approved lenders at approved rates of interest, which under guarantee would be reasonable. And this policy exists today in the form of LMI, Lenders Mortgage Insurance, which some of you may be familiar with for those entering the property market. So Menzies and his government, in its over 16 years in office, the second term, sought to encourage greater home ownership as it provided a stable, secure dwelling place for family life to flourish. Families having autonomy over their property would be spared from the typically transient nature of leases and the destabilising effects these shorter-term living arrangements can have on family life. In addition, home ownership provided an essential anchor for people in their communities. Owning one's dwelling helped give citizens a tangible and permanent stake in the community to which they belonged. In Menzies' own words, home ownership would give us one little piece of earth with a house and a garden which is ours, to which we can withdraw, in which we can be among our friends, into which no stranger may come against our will. It helped reinforce the conservative instincts for security, stability, continuity, and loyalty to people and place. Furthermore, the ownership of one's home provided the best security against any future pauperism and welfare dependency. It would give older Australians the financial security of not having to pay rent into retirement. The housing initiatives of Menzies' second term in office had a palpable effect on Australian home ownership. As the Australian economist Michaela Novak observed, the considerable increase in home ownership throughout the country was an unquestionable hallmark of Australian experience during the mid-20th century. The 1950s and 60s were undoubtedly the golden age of the Australian dream. The images of a young family posing proudly in front of their dream home with the FJ or the EJ Holden parked in the driveway were iconic of the Menzies era, and for good reason. According to ABS data, about 53% of all occupied private dwellings were owned by households with or without a mortgage in 1947, when the Chifley government was still in office. This figure then rose to 63% in 1954, to 70% in 1961, and about 73% in 1966, where it peaked. In the same time span, the share of renters of private properties fell from about 44% in 1947 to just 27% by 1966. Between 1947 and 1971, the total stock of dwellings in Australia increased from about 1.92 million to 4.01 million. Given that housing affordability and ownership are again live issues for today, how can present governments learn from the housing policy initiatives of the Menzies years? What policies would make home ownership more attainable for Australians in a difficult housing market? There is no doubting that Australia is grappling with a current housing crisis, as the gap between wage growth and property price increases has widened inexorably. While the housing situation may not be quite as dire as the austerity years of the immediate post-war period, it is evident home ownership rates have been on a downward trend. Since overall home ownership peaked at 73% in 1966, at the time Menzies left office, it has dropped to 67% in 2021. For younger generations, the decreases are even more pronounced. For 30 to 34-year-olds, the rate in 2021 was just 50% compared to 64% in 1971. And for Australians aged 25 to 29, it is only 36% in 2021 compared with 50% in 1971. Several solutions have been proposed to address the housing affordability crisis. The simple and obvious one is to increase housing supply in an effort to better satisfy demand. According to the New South Wales Productivity Commissioner, Peter Ackerstrup, a rule of thumb in Australia has been that a 10% increase in housing supply leads to a 25% reduction in housing costs. State governments have an important role to play here in releasing more land for housing construction and also in reducing red tape and other bureaucratic impediments to the approvals process for constructing new dwellings. Particularly at the local government level, where often planning bylaws and zoning rules can act as handbrakes on development. Related to this is a need to address the construction skills shortage by incentivising more people to enter the construction industry, as well as improving visa pathways to attract skilled construction workers to boost the building and supply of dwellings. Another solution is to replace stamp duty with a broad-based land tax. The former Perrottet government of New South Wales proposed to abolish stamp duty for first home buyers of properties up to 1.5 million. And the abolition of stamp duty was recommended in a recent report by the Blueprint Institute. Given that stamp duty essentially operates as a conveyancing tax, its removal would facilitate housing mobility by taking away the financial disincentive for people to move home when life circumstances change. This is particularly the case for many older Australians who may wish to downsize and thereby free up larger properties for growing families who need them. These solutions to increasing home ownership are by no means exhaustive, and many more, of course, will be proposed and debated. In 2024, it would be simplistic and unwise to ape the housing policies of Menzies from his own time, but there is no doubting we can draw inspiration from his enduring vision for a flourishing property-owning democracy of strong families and be similarly proactive in making home ownership more affordable and attainable for our own generation and those that follow. Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Chris Beer. I am a historical researcher on Australian cities, Australian urbanism, and which obviously takes in issues such as housing. So today I wish to talk to you about the combination of two of my interests, urban development on the urban fringe and electoral politics, not necessarily a dovetailing of the two, more in order or in succession, but nonetheless brought together by the place of Western Sydney. So I'll begin by acknowledging that Western Sydney encompasses the lands of the Darug, Darawal and Gundagara people, and that they have a continuing connection to that country. So on the left of my slide there is the quote, which the previous speaker has already provided to you, but there it is up in black and white. And in my presentation, I want to, explore the continuing shifting relationship between real estate property and democracy since British-led colonisation of Australia. This can be broken down in the work of, it can be found across Australian history. The work of, for example, John Hurst in the 80s comes to mind, his work on the Comic Society and its enemies and the strange birth of colonial democracy, both make a lot of property and democracy in tension. Property owners against democracy, property owners or writing affluence enabling democracy and breaking down, creating the extension of the franchise. Democracy working against property later in the century, the wars against the legislative battles against the squatters, and then ultimately democracy enabling property, which I think is what we're looking at today, where Australian democracy by the second half of this 20th century has very much been pushing towards greater property ownership. So just to introduce my area of study, as I said, I'm looking at Western Sydney. This is essentially a conflation of, for people who know Sydney, the Cumberland Plain and the idea of the western suburbs, which is a long-standing historical geography in Sydney. Essentially, the idea didn't really exist, as far as I can tell, prior to the 60s. So the two images on the right-hand side of my slide come from advertising from the Prospect County Council, which is essentially an electricity utility. So in the early 60s, they were placing ads in the Sydney Morning Herald telling people to invest money with them to help them broaden their network. And this, gave currency to the idea of Western Sydney as a distinct part of Sydney, or distinct from Sydney proper. The area within, the history has a prominent place within the history of Australian property and democracy. Going back to the colonial era, it is a location of some of the big early property estates, as well as Grace Karskens has recently explored, the rise of smallholders along the Hawkesbury River. It's a site where British property relations were first sought to be extended to Aboriginal people in the form of a land grant to Colby and Nurrunginggi in the Blacktown area. Later in the 19th century, there was considerable suburbanisation along the rail lines. There were soldier settlers in the Bankstown area after the First World War. And then immediately prior to the Menzies Government, the area underwent a bit of a boom in terms of military industrialisation, supporting the Second World War efforts. Essentially, large munitions factories and other such facilities were sprung up in the area. In Australian democracy, it's the home of the MacArthurs and Jack Lang, two very different, features of Australian democratic history. The MacArthurs, obviously, but the MacArthurs being known for their restriction or attempts to restrict the democratic franchise, and Jack Lang perhaps embodying democratic populism in the first half of the 20th century in a way that a few other people spring to mind. So during the study period that we're interested in, or sorry, just before the 61-66 study period, the area underwent significant growth, basically doubling the population in those decades to 1961. So some numbers. In short, this slide outlines the rise of home ownership in the Western Sydney, or both Western Sydney and across Sydney more broadly. You'll see in that far right-hand column, there was from middling to substantial growth in home ownership across different local government areas. These were actually a little bit less than some other parts of Sydney, particularly in central Sydney, which also started from extremely low bases. So you'll see in the city of Sydney, local government area, home ownership was only 5% in 1947. And the Western Sydney, comparing broadly comparably to more historically advantaged areas, so Northern Sydney local government areas of Ku-ring-gai and Willoughby, basically at comparable levels of home ownership by the end of around the early 60s. So this is all good, but this was what historians, Australian urban historians have, I guess, called or discerned as a qualified affluence. The image there on the right hand of the slide is in the Blacktown area in the early 60s. You'll see there's already a row of houses there, but the council workers are catching up, putting in curbs and forming a road where we're following the progression of people actually building their houses. So in the phrase of Peter Spirit is one of the major historians of Sydney in the 20th century. He and one of his co-authors, I think his name is Christine DeMarco, basically characterised Western Sydney as a place of suburbs without services. And this reflected media discourse from the period. So that second dot point there, you have the Sydney Morning Herald lamenting that planning and other governments had really not delivered an outcome in Western Sydney that people would have otherwise expected. The third dot point there comes from the Australian Quarterly, so a current affairs magazine, suggesting that even though these were times of great affluence, there were even people at the top end of the social spectrum. So a £10,000 house around this time was a pretty upmarket house, and 3 cars in the garage, which would have been extremely rare. Second car ownership didn't become common in Australia until the 80s. But still having a pan toilet is unfortunately Australian anachronism in reflecting, I guess, inadequacies in the governance of Australian cities at that time. So the Commonwealth and suburbia. On the right-hand side of the slide is a quote from Robert Menzies at his in his 1961 federal election speech. I bolded there that he talks about his government's involvement in housing as a voluntary performance. So he obviously was willing to be flexible around the Constitution in some senses, but there were limits to this. So that said, Clem Lloyd and Pat Troy have, in their history of the Commonwealth's involvement in urban policy, have noted that Commonwealth involvement in cities and suburbia goes back to the 20s. Housing and there was support for home ownership back to the end of the First World War, particularly around providing housing support for soldiers, as well as road grants to the states. The immigration program was taken over by the Commonwealth in the 20s, which obviously has significant effects on Australian cities, given that most people end up living in Sydney, in cities, I suppose, it's Sydney. There was also, by the 60s, I guess, broader understandings that what was going on in Australia's cities was having broader macroeconomic implications. So that last up point is a quote from the Vernon report that we heard about yesterday, which explicitly called out the growth of Sydney and Melbourne as having real impacts on broader macroeconomic management. So even though the Commonwealth might try and draw a line in saying the cities are a state issue or a state problem, that was becoming increasingly harder to defend. So what I'm calling the rethinking of Australian urbanism and liberalism is can be seen as both the governance, seen as a change in governance or a mindset towards governance that whereby the governments are still sought to encourage property, but where there's recognition that our access to property and interest in property doesn't end at your property boundary. You do have an interest in your wider community. You do have interests in the suburb around you. You have your interest in how your city as a whole functions. And the career of Gough Whitlam and his journey to Cabramatta is an embodiment of this. So as his biographers have pointed out, Gough Whitlam started his life in 1920s Turramurra in northern Sydney, moved to Canberra in the 1930s, moved to Sutherland Shire in southern Sydney in the 40s, and then ended up in Cabramatta in western Sydney in the 50s and thereafter. So essentially, even though he came from a quite privileged background, he had a unique insight into a series of formative outer suburban communities that I guess gave him a sense of how where you live affects your life opportunities. So by the mid-60s, the Sydney Morning Herald was picking up on this sort of these sorts of messages from the Labor Party and others, saying that we're building housing units, not housing communities. And later, after the departure of Menzies, there was a series, I guess there's a series of dot points, or sorry, there's a series of events that the following dot points run through. So essentially, the Commonwealth, within its well-established interest in roads, was starting to take a greater interest in urban roads, not just country roads. Population politics take off in the late 60s. During the Gorton government, the Borey Commission into Population was launched into the effects of population growth in Australia, against the background of people starting talking about zero population growth as being a desirable thing, and against the background of things of such as the Ehrlich population bomb book that was of global significance in the late 60s. And then we have the rise of Hugh Stretton. So Hugh Stretton is one of the leading, I guess, authors on Australian urbanism in the late second half of the 20th century. He has had an interesting career in the sense that he was a bright young thing, went to Oxford on a Rhodes Scholarship on the basis of supported by a reference from Menzies. Menzies knew his parents, and he was happy to help out when he was putting together his Rhodes application. So Stretton comes back to Australia. I believe he was the youngest tenured professor in Australia at that time. Fortunately, had a career that didn't really live up to the expectations, and then takes early retirement, as I understand it, in the 60s or late 60s, and becomes very, very involved in urban thinking about Australian cities. And this becomes influential in, I guess, debates throughout the rest of the century. And ultimately, this culminates in the McMahon government establishing a National Urban and Regional Development Authority just before the 72 election, realising that there needs to be greater coordination between immigration and other aspects of urban development. So, moving on to my second area of interest, this is an electoral map of Western Sydney in the 60s, early 60s, sorry. There was a redistribution in 68, this precedes it. So on the left, there's a list of electorates and luminaries from Australian politics from the era. So there's a real concentration of people who are one way or another in the headlines in Australian federal politics in the 60s. William McMahon represents Lowe, who would obviously go on to become Prime Minister. Tom Hughes, again, I think he was Attorney General. Garfield Barwick, another Attorney General. Tommy Ryan, leader of the Labor left, and later a prominent minister in the Whitlam and Hawke governments, and then of course Gough Whitlam himself. So how did these places journey during this time? So in short, Western Sydney electorates reflected this 1961 swings both for and against the Menzies government. So in 61, Labor picked up the seat of Evans, centred around Ashfield, and it also picked up the seat of Mitchell, which includes what is now Bauple Hills and Blacktown. And these seats both went back to Liberal in 63, along with the seat of Parkes. So that was the seat of Tom Hughes. So this is Tom Hughes entering Parliament at the 63 election. So more broadly, in electoral commentary at the time, Western Sydney was noted as a place of swing seats. In 61, Evans and Mitchell were both predicted to be contested or of potentially vulnerable for the government. In 63, a broader number of seats also seemed to be competitive, including Barwick's Parramatta. In the event, Liberal won those all easily, and the election was far less tight, than some of the commentary at the time expected. So, with all those big names, there's also a rich literature of biographies and autobiographies that you can, or that I have trolled through to see what I can learn about Western Sydney. So, and among, I guess, the key themes that come out in these are that security and sectarianism really were the big issues in Sydney, in Western Sydney at the time. A suggestion is made that, by Garfield Barwick, that he is the author of state aid. Essentially, as he tells it, I believe, Menzies, for some time, there's also McMahon is also part of the picture. Apparently, if you read these biographies and accept them, McMahon had been prompting the government or prompting cabinets to make a move on state aid for some time. Menzies was sensitive to Barwick's marginal status or perceived marginal status in Parramatta, sought Barwick's view on what might fly, what might be acceptable to his voters. Apparently, Barwick claims that he came up with the idea of science blocks as a mechanism by which the government could advance state aid. So I've put the suggestion, is state aid a product of Western Sydney? ? And within these biographies, there's also rich accounts of, I guess, what I call retail politics. What is actually politics on the ground? What does it look like? So David Marr has written wrote a biography of Barwick, not a particularly sympathetic biography in many ways, but he does notably express sympathy to, I guess, Barwick's practice of retail politics and his willingness to endure fashion parades, Hawaiian nights, lessons read at the Church of Christ, Union Jacks presented to the Scouts, and so on. So I should also mention in the background, we also have, I'll just move that to my next slide. We also have Keating and Howard floating around. So in the early 60s, I think someone mentioned this yesterday, Howard was a leader of the Young Liberals. He was also I believe, chair of the Federal Electoral Committee for the Regional Parks and worked as Tom Hughes's campaign director, also working with his brother, or Hughes's brother, Robert Hughes, to work to get Tom Hughes elected. So summing it all up, where's this all gone since then? Western Sydney now forms about 10% of the national population. So putting aside Sydney and Melbourne, it can be argued it's the third largest city in Australia. There has been I guess, shifting language and substance of Commonwealth urban involvement. So following the work of the McMahon government, the initiation of the McMahon government of the National Urban and Regional Development Authority, the Whitlam government established a full federal department, which had a brief but bright career. Subsequent Commonwealth involvement in the cities has been more patchy. But that said, there's Commonwealth infrastructure spending in cities, even if it's not labelled as urban policy or labelled as a deliberately city-making activity, is nonetheless a major thing that the Commonwealth has done in the decades since. In electoral politics, we've obviously, as people mentioned yesterday, entered an era of true post-sectarianism. The sectarianism that, I guess, was central to the early political lives of Keating and Howard was not really a thing by the time they actually were prime ministers. And I'm ending here on a thought exercise. So we obviously had Keating followed by Howard, 16 years they were prime minister between them. Is this something of a Canterbury Bankstown? Can this be seen as something as a Canterbury Bankstown ascendancy? what links these people together? What links these two men together in terms of their appeal to the Australian people? As in musing over this, I was going back through Professor Bongiorno's Dreamers and Schemers, and his quote on, in there's a quote from Bob Askins, the Premier of New South Wales in the 60s, who won a few elections. And Bob Askins' electoral philosophy is that, or one of his electoral pieces of wisdom was the idea that voters that look for someone of their ilk, but slightly up the social scale. And someone of their ilk, but who has done well, and they've reached a position slightly up the social scale, but haven't gone too far up. So I think Keating and Hawke, in their ways, can be seen as embodying that, but obviously that's just a very tentative thought. Or it could be the lightning just strikes twice. Who knows? Thank you.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.